yeah, this will be. I've been a number of times to Brazil, and then grew up in Peru and Chile. It's very different, but yeah, Brazil's been a place of spiritual renewal for me.
So this is actually one of the reasons why I wanted you on the podcast, because I feel like your life is so interesting. It just feels like you have traveled everywhere, and I kind of want to hear the journey and the story of how you got there. I know you and I chatted over, what was it, Chinese? You took me to a Chinese restaurant first time. Yeah, I know you talked to me a little bit about it, but I would actually love for you to kind of share your story leading up to the Diaspora Network and how you got involved, and maybe you could even share about the intention, the purpose behind the Diaspora Network, because I know there are quite a few people that watch this podcast and are actually interested in the vision of the Diaspora Network and what you guys are all about. So we could do that. But first and foremost, before we do that, I want to first thank you for taking your time to just, have a conversation with me via online podcast. And I really appreciate you for taking your time to do this. Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah. Awesome.
That's a privilege. Yeah. So movement, migration, diaspora, cultures, languages is in my family DNA. So when people ask about the vision of Diaspora Network, I tell them it's part of my family story. And so, on my dad's side, my last name, Kindberg, is Swedish, and my great-grandparents were Swedish and Dutch immigrants to the United States, came through Ellis Island, Statue of Liberty from Europe, and settled in New Jersey. And so my grandfather would have been second generation Swedish American, grew up hearing Swedish at home. He went to Wheaton College and was part of the same class, with my grandmother as well. They met there, but with Jim and Elizabeth Elliott, who are, some of your listeners may have heard of them, kind of in the 60s, 70s era of global mission, were killed in Ecuador. Are fairly well known and kind of history of U.S. missions. But they were in the same class with him at Wheaton College, and they went then on global mission to Peru, unreached people group in the middle of the Amazon jungle, where my dad was born. And then my dad, kind of fast forward a little bit, met my mom back in the U.S., and then he went also on global mission. And so I was born in Peru with my sister. And so from migration to Europe to the U.S., and then global mission to Latin America, this is part of my family story. Wow. We lived in Peru, Chile, Panama, some kind of little stints back in the U.S., and my parents worked with minority or indigenous people groups in those countries. And so it wasn't just the national language, which was Spanish, but they also spent time with the Mapuche in Chile, which is another language group, and Quechua in Peru. Mapuche.
Okay, Mapuche.
Yeah. Quechua in Peru, and then Guaymi and Panama. And so, similar to Ethiopia, where you have a number of different languages, Latin America has national language, and then some countries like Mexico have 250 different indigenous languages. So anyway, all that to say is, grew up always between cultures and languages, and so as an adult, I spent time in the Middle East thinking I might be a missionary in working with potentially Muslims, and spent time with Palestinians and in the Middle East during college. And then after college, moved into this little apartment complex outside suburbs of Chicago, close to where my church was meeting, that had, 20 or 30 different ethnic groups that were an immigrant refugee apartment complex, and realized that God was bringing the nations, the world here, and started a Spanish-speaking church in my apartment, which essentially kind of redirected my life towards working with migrants, immigrants, refugees in the U.S. So fast forward, then from there, I moved to Austin, Texas, just about 3 years ago, and I'd helped start some other similar networks in Chicago and other places, but started gathering and meeting with immigrant churches here in the city, and as a kind of a growing, very new, kind of newer global city. Austin has grown with the tech sector, and the last 5-10 years has seen kind of a large number of immigrants, and so growth of the immigrant church. But no one really knew each other outside of their own, African churches, or maybe Nigerian churches, or Ethiopian churches knew each other, but the Latino churches or the Nepali. So part of the vision is to bring together a network of the global church in the city for the sake of working together for the transformation of the city. But the vision behind it is believing that the majority of immigrants that come to the United States are Christian, and that really immigrants represent one of the greatest hopes for renewing the church in North America and renewing our cities. And so how do we come around, add fuel to that fire of churches like the one that you're at, and both first and second generation, kind of mobilizing the immigrant church, empowering the next generation, and then building partnerships in the city. So that's kind of the broad overview.
Yeah, that's incredible. As I told you before, growing up in Canada, in my, I would say, around the age of 18 to around 22, there was a man from Dallas, Texas, who came to Canada to plant Hybrid Church. And his vision was very unique because it wasn't like anything that I've heard or seen before. And his vision, and the reason why he called it hybrid, was because he himself also noticed that there were many immigrants coming to North America, specifically Canada, Edmonton, Alberta, where we were at. And it was becoming this melting pot of different nationalities, different ethnicities. And he really had a desire to reach out to this, widespread population of, immigrants that were coming to Canada. And I really love it, because I think that's one of the desires of the Diaspora Network that I really was drawn towards was your guys' focus on immigrant people who are coming to North America. I find that, usually when immigrants come to North America, they want to find a community that they can relate to, connect to. Hence the reason why maybe there's specifically Ethiopian churches or Chinese churches or, Mexican churches. There's a specific ethnicity that could bring in these immigrants so that they could call it home, right? And I'm very curious about your endeavor, especially with the Diaspora Network, to connect these nationalities together. What do you find to be challenging in connecting these different nationalities together to kind of unite the church as one? What do you find to be challenging about that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely in the immigrant church, but not only, also in broader what we call non-immigrant churches, whether that's African American or predominantly white American churches. There's a deep ingrained kind of isolation in that people are used to doing things with their own tribe, whether that's ethnicity or language or denomination, Pentecostals or the Baptists or the Reformed or whatever, or the Nigerians here and the Ethiopians there and Nepali there. And so just bringing people together, and even with an openness to partner and learn and build relationships, is a huge challenge. And there's great differences. There's often reasons why we don't hang out with whatever group or club, or because there are differences, and some of them are language, some of them are culture, some of them are denominational or theological, etc. And so sometimes those things can keep us apart. However, believe is that there's deep richness and gifts that each group has. And so, for example, the gifts that the Ethiopian church bring to the city are deeply needed by others. And, maybe the Korean or some of the Asian churches have gifts that you need as longer experience working with next generation in the US or whatever the resource or the gift might be. And so, but that's just one of the challenges versus this mindset of isolation often, or differences in culture, language, like, even a lot of immigrant churches, not all, but many have bivocational pastors. And so there's just in some ways less time margin. And then a lot of, say, non-immigrant churches, the staff are often more full-time. And right. So often immigrant churches will try to do meetings with pastors and stuff on the weekends. Non-immigrant churches prefer to do that during the week.
That's right.
And Saturdays are like family day, or like, hey, kind of. And so even just when to gather, how to gather, what language to gather is a challenge. And then, but we believe the blessings and the potential impact is greater, of course, than the challenges.
Yeah, definitely. When I was at the lunch, I think that was probably one of the most inspiring parts about being there. I honestly, I really left there super encouraged. It's been only 2.5 months, close to 3 months now, that I've moved to Austin with my wife. And one of the prayers that I prayed was for me to get connected with other pastors, teachers, leaders here in the Austin area. And it was just very nice to see number one, the unity. Number two, the love and the support. And three, I think the genuineness as well was something that really, really caught my attention. So I just say all that to say, I think you're doing a really great job.
Praise the Lord.
You're definitely doing the Lord's work, and it's working. So it's very nice to see. Very, very nice to see. So I want to go back a little bit, if you don't mind, to kind of maybe your upbringing. You did mention, correct me if I'm wrong, you did mention that your dad was a missionary, correct?
Parents and grandparents.
Okay.
So
parents and grandparents.
2 generations, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So clearly you grew up in a Christian home. Yeah, and you grew up with Christian values. And so what, I know this might be a broad and general question, but what was that like growing up? Did you ever feel like there was freedom? Did you ever feel like you had this pressure in order to kind of continue on the work that your parents had started? Like, maybe go into that a little bit, because I'm very curious as to what that looked like in your upbringing for you as a child.
Yeah, definitely a sort of ministry mission is the family business, for better and for worse sometimes.
Sure.
And some of my family's story on the worst side, or the for worse, so to speak, is that sometimes mission, ministry, sort of this public image was used to hide sin or hide brokenness. And there can be I think it's a temptation for anybody that's in ministry of any kind, but there can be a hypocrisy that can be bred of, like, people have you on their, you visit families and you're literally stuck on their fridge, picture of your family, missionary that we're praying for.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
But behind that image can be all kinds of complexity, And so I think anyone that has, son of pastors or so forth, I think some of what I share, and I actually try to share pretty openly about, though there's a lot of pain, is my grandfather, after helping translate the Bible into this language and in the middle of the Amazon jungle, and many, planting churches, ended up having multiple affairs and divorced my grandmother. And so sometimes I think probably the challenge is even like how to not replace being with God and a relationship with God with doing for God, and
Wow,
this
that's
kind
really
of
good.
public, service. And I never had sort of some folks have this sort of like rebellion period where they have to leave the church, and because of all they've seen the inside, and it's kind of
Yeah.
messy. I didn't have that as much, but I did. I continue to have things that I have to sort of bring to the Lord for healing and air out in terms of that particular temptation. And
Mm,
um, I think what I saw too often is that family was sometimes deprioritized over ministry. Serving
mm,
others sometimes more important than serving family, and so there's some pain there. And um, but overall, my particular experience was a blessing. I'm grateful.
amazing.
Yeah, and because I learned Spanish growing up, and I've learned interacting with different cultures. I can do what I do now. That's part of the my that piece of my story that God has used to bless others, and so I'm grateful for that, and grateful for the complexity there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was Billy Graham who said that one of his deepest regrets was that he didn't spend enough time with Ruth, his wife, and
Mm.
his children,
Yeah,
because he was so caught up in ministry and doing ministry all the
yeah,
time.
yeah, for sure.
And it's quite interesting to me. I feel like there's a shift happening, especially in this generation, where maybe we have, I don't know, maybe learned the lessons of the generation before us, where if they are called into ministry, I think there is the shift that where it's like we prioritize family and we prioritize our wives or our children's, our husbands, and it's really actually encouraging to see, because I think that approach is obviously much more healthy as opposed
For
to.
sure, for sure.
Yeah, because it's so interesting to me. I think the lines could be sometimes so blurred between being, like you said it best, being with God as opposed to doing something for God. I think sometimes we think that they are one and the same, and they can be, but if you don't mind, I mean, you've been pastoring way longer than I have. So you obviously have much more wisdom and experience. But what would you say to maybe young pastors like me who, are trying to pastor or trying to follow the Lord, who are trying to really please the Lord, and also at the same time trying to develop an intimate quality relationship with the Lord? What advice would you give my generation to kind of walk in what you mentioned, which is being with God as opposed to just doing things for God?
Yeah. To me, I mean, it's not an original idea to me, obviously, but Sabbath is like the foundation for that.
Mm,
And
mm,
so, literally beginning our week and our ordering our days and times and schedules around rest
so
first.
good.
And and so, actually, literally prioritizing being with God a day of a week where you're not doing for Him, and He's in charge. In this,
Mm,
like He should be every day, but really, there's one day a week that. And so, for me, that's been Mondays for
mm,
maybe 15 plus years, and it's shifted and changed a little bit, but um, I, I I encourage people like not to be legalistic, but to actually be very
sure.
intentional and disciplined,
Mm,
and to say actually, yeah, I mean it is one of the Ten Commandments, and
yeah, yeah.
Jesus Himself, before He did ministry, spent 40 days in the wilderness and regularly went off by himself to pray. If Jesus needed it,
Yeah.
how much more so? And I think folks like I don't know if you've read Rich Viodas or John Mark Comer, the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, but Thai, there's kind of a recognition that often technology, social media, cell phones, takes up so much of our bandwidth as well. And so for me, it's a day to play, pray, and rest. And part of that is I turn my phone off for most of the day, and I never, at least very, very rarely, schedule anything on a Monday other than time with my wife and time with God and time with friends if it's rejuvenating. So to me, that's like the starting point. That then there's a lot of other things, regular retreats, days away, other friendships with other peers that can hold you accountable and that know really what's going on, that aren't a part of your church. Yeah, there's a whole host of things, but to me, Sabbath is one of the foundational pieces.
Thank you for sharing that. That is really practical, and I think could help a lot of people. I don't know about your generation, but I know my generation, especially with social media involved and the constant indoctrination of social media that it continually feeds, there is this mentality. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but like a grind culture, where you're just constantly on the go. One person that kind of reminds me of this is and not to bash him or anything like that, but it's just we got to be super cautious when we hear certain things. But and it's I believe is coming from good intent. But Steve Harvey I would always see his videos pop up on my feed, and clearly that's telling because it's obviously I'm watching him, so it's just giving me back what I'm looking at. But he would always be like, if you want to be like successful, what are you doing sleeping for 8 hours? What are you doing, sleeping for that long? You should be on the hustle and you should be on the grind. And like, I get the sentiment, like I understand the sentiment of work hard. And I think there is biblical precedence for working hard. However, I think there should be a balance, living your life balance, and also working as well. And I don't know, why don't, maybe I just gave the answer, but from your perspective, why do you think that people don't take Sabbath seriously? Christians.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole host. I think for immigrants and children of immigrants, there's an added pressure. If you're second gen 1.5 and your parents sacrificed to come here for the sake of giving you a better future, there's even more pressure to perform, to succeed, to get a good education from them. And otherwise, it's like, I sacrificed all this for you. And that's a super, super common pressure that 1.5 and second gen feel, so, whether it's you're working in the tech industry or a doctor or a nurse or whatever it might be, you're also trying to provide for your broader family and often sending money back home in a way that others that aren't as connected to the immigrant story might not have. So I think that's a pressure. And there's often, for first gen folks, survival. I mean, I know folks, you're working multiple jobs to pay bills. And so often, and this is the parallel that I see is with, the slaves in Egypt, like literally they were not allowed to rest. They were supposed to build bricks, and that was, one of the first things that God allowed them to do after they were free was to rest and to take Sabbath.
Wow.
And so
that's good.
Part of it's tied into how the immigration system works, especially in the U.S. I'm less familiar with the system in Canada, but in the U.S., the immigrant reality is the grind. So that's really hard pressure to push up against. And the American dream too of success and
That's right.
Of like, what does it mean? It has the house and the good education and all these things can also be very anti-biblical at times. But I think often it's a more internal thing of like, particularly if you're thinking of folks in terms of pastors or work with the church or so forth, there's an internal, like, this is good work, right? This is important work. It's a funeral, sharing the gospel with someone, we say this has eternal consequences. And so there can be, man, yeah, I gotta like keep working. And how do I like take a nap when someone might go to hell? This can be like if I don't go now and share the gospel. But what that is rooted in is a faulty understanding of what mission is and our place in the kingdom, because it's not up to us, And if it is up to us, then it's going to be a never-ending grind. Or if it's up to you to provide for your family, that's a never-ending grind, or whatever the lie might be. But like Sabbath is ultimately rooted in this idea God's in control. It's his mission, his church. It's actually not up to me, so I can rest. He can take, like, it's actually, yes, God invites us to participate with him and for sure in his mission. That's a privilege, but his work is not dependent on us. Like, it's actually often goes out like despite us, he does this thing. So really it's like, what's my view of God? What's my view of myself in the kingdom? What's my view? If for most folks, and there's cultural pressures too to perform and do a lot, and Austin is a very busy city, or it's different pace. If you go back to Ethiopia often, or rural areas, or Latin America, like, so there's cultural dynamics there too of the U.S. of like, here money is time, and so it's a multifaceted deal, but a lot of it ultimately is rooted in what do we think of ourselves and our place in the kingdom.
I hear you saying that we have a Messiah complex sometimes. This idea of we're the ones who are in control. We're the ones that have to save. We're the ones that have to provide.
For sure. Or we're functional atheists, is another way some people put it, It's like we're 6 days a week. Atheists. Like, we can say we believe in God and all this stuff, but then the way we live is ultimately believe in me. If I don't do it, it won't happen.
Wow. Do you think that's, pardon me if I use this term, but do you think that's the stronghold in today's generation? Do you think it's the dependence on self? It's this idea of we're in control. We're the ones that should determine our way, our path. And it definitely creeps into the church. But I don't know. Do you feel like this is the stronghold in this generation? Does that make sense, by the way?
Yeah. I would say a stronghold for sure. Is it the main one? I don't know. I think there's probably a number.
Yeah, many.
And each generation has its own struggles,
Sure.
But I think, particularly if we're talking the immigrant context or immigrant churches or next generation, the rooting of our identity in what we do and in certain measures of success is a huge lie, or a huge shaping of, and I think there's this double bind, or like this lose-lose of like, on one side, we have to define ourselves by what our family thinks and their expectations. What does it mean to be a good Ethiopian, or to do success based on my parents' standards? That's more communal. But in the US or in Canada, you have the world telling you, be your individual self, do what you want to do, self-actualize, your feelings are more important. And that's a whole, so you have these two competing, very different, the collective, the culture back home or whatever, and then success, how that's measured, and success, what's measured by broader American or Canadian often white, not always, but often white standards. And I think immigrants, especially next gen, are stuck in between these. And it's like both are actually have a number of lies, and you get this from both sides. And so, what do I believe? Who am I? What is success? What am I striving for? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. I Fatima was also sharing a little bit about this when I was chatting with her, and this really complexity of, especially as 1.5 or 2.0s. By the way, let's define our terms. Just for people who don't know, 1.5, when we're referring to 1.5, what you and I are saying are immigrant children who are born and raised in their country and have come to North America, correct? Are we in agreement with that?
Yeah, or usually came, often people would say before they were teenagers.
Okay,
And
before
so
the
they have
teenagers.
enough time in the US or Canada or wherever to really pick up a significant uh, both language and culture and stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
And so usually if you come the later after teenage years, or you might not have done school in the US, you end up being more heavily leaning towards, Amharic or towards Ethiopian culture or wherever.
Yeah, yeah. And 2.0 would be me. I was born and raised in Canada, but my parents are from Ethiopia. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, got you. I'm sure you're familiar with this term acculturation. And correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm getting the definition right or wrong, but it's this idea that we usually begin to mold and shape our identity based off of the dominant culture that we're in. Is that correct? Instead of the culture that we have at home?
I mean, acculturation, I think generally, how I understand it at least, would be the process of picking up and adapting to a culture. And so,
Okay. Is it usually the dominant one?
not necessarily,
Not necessarily.
like again, it depends on a lot of things, but part of marginalization in the US, for example, is you can have, say, Latinos and who grew up in a Latino majority city in the US, which is many spaces now, who may have had very little interaction with white Americans or even anyone outside Latino world. But and so they can actually maintain to a significant degree Latino culture's value, often language, and live in this parallel world to, say, dominant or broader U.S. And so the process of acculturation, in other words, of picking up, is depends on like a lot of factors.
Gotcha.
So for example, Ethiopian families, whether Canada or in the US, say you move to a small town where there's very few other Ethiopians. The acculturation is probably going to, the forces of acculturation, sometimes assimilation is a different word, you're going to, more likely you're going to be forced to pick up the surrounding dominant.
That's right.
But if you move into a place where there's a lot of Ethiopians and there's an Ethiopian church, and and maybe there's a lot of Ethiopians at the school you go to, or acculturation may happen and less so than at that small, if you move to New York City, or you move to, I don't know, a big city in Canada, you might not have to acculturate, or how that looks is just going to be, there's just a number of factors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So I think what I hear you saying is it depends on the probably intentionality, or even the surrounding of that individual. Like if they are connected, like they come to North America and they're connected to an Ethiopian church, they'll probably adapt to the Ethiopian culture as opposed to the more broader culture in North America. But if there is maybe a small minority of Ethiopians and maybe not too much culture there, they'll most likely adapt to the North American culture. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors. The
Okay.
number of
Okay.
people from that people group is one, the
Mm,
age which you came to,
mm,
the education level of your parents,
okay.
um,
Mm,
and then intentionality for sure.
mm,
Whether you did public school or private, all those are factors that influence acculturation.
got you. Got you. Okay.
So often,
Mm,
if say your parents, I don't know your family story, but say your parents have they've traveled a lot and they have
mm,
number of they already have a multicultural perspective, and then they immigrate and they have high education, and
mm.
then they put you in a context where you're in with different people groups. You're probably gonna adapt, but it's not one or the other, because the idea of
Yeah. Mm,
biculturalism is actually you can acculturate to multiple spaces at the same time potentially.
got you. Mm,
That's often the 1.5, especially if you came really early and young. You're probably more likely to be fully or more fully bilingual, bicultural, but
got
it
you.
depends on a lot of factors. Yeah.
Got you. And I asked this because does acculturation really play into the identity crisis that we're seeing in a lot of immigrant children coming here?
Yeah, I mean the process of like like where do I fit in
Mm,
with these multiple spaces, and
sure.
so all of these
Mm,
factors will shape that. But for example, yeah, if you have parents that only speak Amharic or only speak
mm,
Spanish, and
mm,
you're at home, that's the primary environment, but then you're in school in English, um, and with say non-Ethiopians, yeah,
mm.
you're going to have you're already living in very multiple realities, and so that's the questions of then where do I fit in fully, or um, so all those are factors for sure. But yeah,
Yeah.
growing up between cultures, between languages, in multiple spaces, kind of this in betweenness is often in a different way too. But like for myself, growing up, I'm white American, but I grew up speaking Spanish in school, English at home. My dad was also born in Peru,
Mm.
so who am I? Where am I in terms of race, ethnicity, culture? It's kind of complicated. It doesn't fit
Did
the
did you
boxes.
did you deal with that? Did you deal with the complexity of trying to find your identity ever?
Oh, I still do. Yeah, that's an
Yeah.
ongoing, like every
Mm.
day, and I'm married now to a woman who's second gen from India, Indian
Yeah.
family,
Yeah.
but grew up in Houston. She, in some ways, is more quote unquote American than I am.
Mm.
She's lived her whole life in the U.S., where I have mostly just my adult life. Um, and so, but then racially, I'm perceived as white, so we walk into, say, a Spanish speaking church, and they will immediately they'll assume she's probably Latina and speak to her in Spanish
Interesting.
first. I'll respond in Spanish. She's learning Spanish, but she's not fluent by any means, you know. And so, just how I'm perceived, like every single day, over and over, I have, um, you know, the being misperceived, or because it's there's
Yeah.
layers of this that aren't apparent in just the way your body looks, etc.
That's right. How are you navigating that? How are you reconciling this complexity about maybe your identity, and then to add into that, as a Christian?
Yeah, it's a journey for sure, and
Sure.
so
Mm,
and it's a different journey for everybody.
yeah.
For me, some key pieces for that, which often, I have similarities and differences with like the second gen or next gen
Mm,
experience, but similarities, a big part of that has been the importance of going back to places I grew up in as an adult.
mm,
And
mm,
so I always encourage also, whether Ethiopian or Indian or whatever, to go to your parents' ancestral home, learn if you can, push into as much of your family's story and language, and like the more you go back, the more you actually know how to move forward. And so, for me, it was as an adult going back to my childhood home in Chile
mm.
multiple times was this really healing and also um, powerful experience of like, oh wow, in some ways, going back, I felt like I really belonged as
Wow.
an adult, but then other ways I didn't. But it's like it's sometimes it's called working the fragments, and so particularly people that are
Mm,
in between these boxes or cultures,
mm,
next gen folks or multiracial folks. This is a phrase from a theologian whose name I'm forgetting right now. Who talks about we work in fragments, and so part of the journey is bringing whole what whether migration or racism or whatever has separated. And so,
separated.
like, how do I reconcile having this Latino cultural and piece of part of my story in Spanish with my heritage, from Europe and my time in the U.S. And part of it is like not separating them or saying it's either or, but how is it a both and? How do I,
Wow.
I took Spanish Latino dance classes and learned to dance salsa and bachata, merengue, and that was a way for me to. That was not something I grew up doing, but a way to literally with my body connect in Latin music. So then Lenny and I's wedding, we had Bollywood and songs in Spanish, and then white pop songs from the U.S. Like, it's again, some of that work is connecting, being intentional about being in spaces, about places where I'm learning, reading books in Spanish, working on my Spanish, learning Portuguese as an adult, things like that.
Mm,
It's like bringing the fragments together.
yeah.
Yeah,
By the way, I love that, and I really connect with that, especially last year, as I told you, 2023. My wife and I ended up being in Ethiopia for 7, 8 months, and I had not been to Ethiopia in over 18 years. So it was a long, long time
wow.
since I've been back. And I share the same sentiment as you. I had different expectations going to Ethiopia. I had some preconceived notions of going back. And I,
Did you
when
think it was
I,
going to be this like really easy homecoming? Was that the preconception, or
no,
that it was going to be
no.
really hard?
Yes, that it was going to be really hard.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I wasn't gonna be able to fit in. I mean, I I speak a little bit of the language, but
Mm.
not fluently.
Okay.
Not especially not like my wife. I mean, she's
Mm.
fluent, right? She
Mm.
reads and she writes, and so I thought I was really going to be disengaged, disinterested. I thought I was going to be bored. I thought I was going to be really disconnected.
Mm.
And as soon as I landed, I just, I don't know what happened. I just felt like I belonged.
Mm.
I just started connecting with the people really easily. I started
Mm.
loving the culture, the atmosphere, like everything. And it's kind of weird for me to say because I am Ethiopian and I grew up in an
Yeah.
Ethiopian home, but it was just so different going back
It's
and
not the
seeing
whole
people
of who
telling
you
me
are, because you
exactly,
have other parts of you. Yeah.
exactly, and just I love that. Uh, what is it? Working out the fragments,
Working the fragments. Yeah.
working the fragments. And thank you for sharing that because I think that puts language to what I experienced in Ethiopia because I didn't know what was happening. But I think what was happening was I was working together the fragments of, what maybe my parents, going to Canada, yeah, just kind of separated that, but going back
Yeah.
helped me to put it together again.
Yeah. There's a
Yeah,
reintegration. Yeah, and
yeah,
potentially healing. Um, Yeah, and for some people, it can be the other way around, or it can be
mm,
really painful. You go back and you have your family make fun of you because you don't speak the language
sure.
well, or um, like it's complicated. Yeah, it's complicated, but it has the potential for being really healing and integrating.
Yeah. Two last questions, if you don't mind. I
Yeah,
don't want to take up too much
no,
of your
no.
time. I guess I was debating between one or two questions for the first one, and then the last one um, I have in my mind. But the two questions I was debating between was, what is your heart for the next generation? I was either going to ask you that, or I was going to ask you, what does the future of the Diaspora Network look like? So actually, I'm going to give you the power to choose which one you would love to answer.
I mean, they're interrelated, so perhaps I can
Okay,
hit
you
hit, hit
connect
them
them
hit
both.
them both. Yeah. I mean, with the next gen, we believe that 1.5 second gen folks are, because of all these things we've been talking about, this in between experience, sometimes called the liminal experience,
Mm,
are uniquely equipped to be the global Christian leaders of the future, the
mm,
bridge builders, the ambassadors of reconciliation that our
mm,
cities like Austin or Calgary, Alberta, or New York City desperately need.
mm,
Because our cities are only becoming more multi-ethnic, our world is only becoming more multicultural. We need people that can go between and can cross and can connect with
mm,
people. And so for the next generation, part of our vision is to equip and form global Christian leaders, which is another way of simply saying, ambassadors of reconciliation,
mm,
that have a vision beyond just their own ethnic community, and a vision beyond even their own church of the kingdom, that God,
mm.
connecting their story then with the mission of God. And so it connects with the second question you had. This year as Diaspora Network, we've focused on the next generation, and have a cohort, which will continue as well next year. And I have cohorts every year, Lord willing. But next year, we're going to move towards focusing on church planting, and
Wow.
believe that the next gen, such as yourself, because of that, again, that in between experience, are uniquely equipped to help plant uh, both next generation congregations, but also multi ethnic congregations.
Mm,
And the immigrant church has the potential to impact the nations, particularly through the next generation. And so, but next year we're going to be developing and strengthening our vision for church planting and our training and
mm.
equipping for leaders. And we're hoping that we can help be a part of churches like yours and uh, other both first and second generation churches, and that would impact the nations that God is bringing to our global cities from all over the world.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm actually going to get you to share with me any links that you want me to put in the description so that people
Yeah,
could get connected to the Diaspora Network. That would be
thank
great.
you. Yeah, that
Yeah,
sounds
yeah, of
awesome.
course. Of course. So, last question. I asked this to all my guests. This podcast is called the Make God Known podcast.
Yeah,
And the question that I have for you is, what is your advice to people to make God known?
yeah. Um, I like Ephesians 3:10, and we use this in our uh, next generation cohort as well. But it says,
Mm,
so that the multifaceted wisdom of God might be made known through the
mm,
church. Um,
mm,
another kind of translation of that word, like multifaceted, is like
mm,
tapestry or the
mm,
diversity. Um, and so we believe that the way to both make God known and to know Him better ourselves actually involves seeing Him through other people's eyes. And so, my
mm.
like I've gotten to know God better by worshiping in Amharic, by experiencing uh, God through Ethiopian brothers and sisters. And similarly, then part of my encouragement is like is for people to step into other cultures, to visit churches from other believers, from other backgrounds in your city,
Mm.
to build relationships cross culturally, and that's one of the ways to actually expand your vision for God. Like,
Wow.
Koreans. You might have heard Korean style prayer, which is this.
Yeah, yeah.
Koreans are known for their fervent prayer. Like, visit a Korean
Mm.
church, and experience that passionate prayer. Or, Nigerians are known for often their music and like vibrancy.
Yeah.
Visit a Nigerian brother church. Like, get out of your own cultural
Mm.
spaces or bubbles, which all of us have. That's one of the ways, both to ourselves experience God in a deeper way, like the church, the multifaceted wisdom of God displayed through the diversity of the church, but also, verses like John 17 talk about that unity is one of the ways to
Mm.
make God known. So that
Mm.
they will know that you have sent me, is part of Jesus' prayer for oneness. And so, one of the great witnesses of the church is when we actually come together across all these differences that in the world's eyes are very irreconcilable, Israeli Palestinian, or, Ethiopian Eritrean, or whatever it might be. When we push into those, like Ethiopians hanging out with Muslims from Somalia or whatever it might be, and sharing the gospel, like when we can bring unity across differences, the world pays attention to, because it's so rare. And so that's one of our prayers for Diaspora Network, but for everyone, is that we would make God known and the beauty of who he is by coming together in the midst of differences and languages and cultures and backgrounds.
Wow. So well said. There is nothing to add to that.
Praise the Lord.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate you and just taking your time to be on the podcast. Seriously, you dropped a lot of wisdom, and I hope that people receive, are encouraged, and also take action too. I think it's so important. So, anyways, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's a blessing to be on here and to talk with you.
Absolutely. I hope you enjoyed that video. I want to give you guys a few reminders before you guys leave. Please subscribe, comment, and also like the video. The more engagement there is, the better. Second, if you want to be notified on when these videos come out, click the bell button on the top right-hand corner of the YouTube page. And lastly, if you want to check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please click the link down below in the description. Other than that, have a great day, guys. Ciao.